the revival of the negotiation process and new sanctions against Russia. Today, July 28, a meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and US President Donald Trump concluded in the Oval Office of the White House. It lasted for more than an hour, was held behind closed doors without the press, and as a result, both sides are talking about, quote, the intensification of the negotiation process. Meanwhile, the Kremlin stated that Donald Trump did not even plan to call Vladimir Putin today. That's an interesting point. Donald Trump is meeting personally with Volodymyr Zelensky for the second time this July, but completely ignores the other Vladimir Putin. On the same day, a group of US senators announced that they had reached a bipartisan agreement on a bill for new sanctions against Russia, with the authority to impose tariffs of up to 100%. And today, Zelensky will address the senators, who will ultimately be the ones to pass this law. It is also telling that the Senate has already hinted that symbolically they may make the decision in the chamber with Zelensky present to begin considering the law on sanctions against Russia. In other words, to officially launch it. The significance of these two events together is that for the first time in several months, the diplomatic track around the war in Ukraine has finally begun to move again. Well, at least at the level of statements. Let's break down in this episode what exactly happened today in Washington regarding Ukraine, what's behind the wording of both sides, and how justified are the expectations of a breakthrough after the meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss and summarize the Trump-Zelensky meeting. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're approaching 300,000 subscribers, so I will be grateful for every subscription. So, Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky held a closed meeting today at the White House without the press, and even without Vice President J.D. Vance. Let's start with the facts about the meeting itself. According to the White House, the bilateral talks between Trump and Zelensky began at 9:47 a.m. Eastern Time. Well, for the pedants, I'll note that the meeting was exactly 17 minutes late if we go by Donald Trump's preliminary schedule for today. Formally, the reason for Zelensky's visit to Washington was the farewell ceremony for Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who passed away on July 11 in his 72nd year, and for many years he was one of the key supporters of military aid to Ukraine in the Senate. The farewell took place in the rotunda of Congress, and Zelensky, in his own words, at the start of his meeting with Trump, he offered condolences for the American senator's death. And here I should immediately note that at the time of recording this episode, Volodymyr Zelensky, Donald Trump, and the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, arrived at the rotunda to bid farewell to Lindsey Graham. And so, in the corridors of the rotunda, there was an interesting dialogue between Zelensky and Netanyahu. Judging by their facial expressions and the intensity with which they spoke, it was clear they weren't talking about the weather, but for now it's unknown what exactly they discussed, although they did shake hands at the end. Now I'll show you this clip. Maybe some of you can read lips, and you'll see what Zelensky was talking about with Netanyahu. But let's get back to the talks between Trump and Zelensky. The composition of the Ukrainian delegation indicates that the visit was not purely ceremonial. Most likely, it was the substantive nature of the negotiations that made them closed door. On the other hand, I should make an important note. Trump's talks with Netanyahu were also closed door. And here we can assume that, in general, they were held without the press so as not to shift the focus away from today's funeral of Senator Lindsey Graham. Joining Zelensky at the negotiations were the head of the President's office, Kirill Budanov, and the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Rostem Umerov. The acting head of the Foreign Ministry, Andrei Sybiga, the deputy heads of the President's office, Pavel Polisa and Sergei Kislitsa, the head of the Servant of the People faction, David Arakamia, and the ambassador of Ukraine to the USA, Olga Stefanishina. This is the team that, I should note, handles both the negotiation and defense tracks. So the topics of the meeting include the issue of military aid, including the license for the production of Patriot missiles, as well as the issue of reviving peace negotiations with the Russians. Honestly, the Russians are still on the sidelines. Zelensky himself described the meeting as good afterward. In his post on Telegram, he said the following, quote, "A good meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office. I am grateful for everything we will do together to protect the lives of Ukrainians and achieve peace." According to him, there were two main issues discussed. One was Kyiv obtaining a license to produce American interceptor missiles for the Patriot systems. And importantly, ways to intensify peace negotiations with the Russians. Kirill Budanov, head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, described the meeting's results. According to him, during the meeting between Zelensky, Trump, and the American delegation, there was a substantive conversation, and Kyiv and Washington agreed to intensify the negotiation process at various levels. And it is precisely this point that is linked to the expectations regarding what comes next. The Ukrainian side expects that in the coming days, a separate meeting between Ukrainian and American officials will take place in the United States. And let me remind you that this visit was preceded by a phone conversation between Volodymyr Zelensky and the special representatives of the United States, Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, about the prospects for resuming peace talks with Russia. Moreover, there have already been leaks and insider reports in the media that the White House is preparing new ideas for negotiations, and one of these ideas is the announcement of an air ceasefire. So that Ukraine and Russia would refrain from mutual strikes on civilian cities. And now, after this meeting between the Ukrainian delegation and Trump, they will now be meeting separately with American officials at a technical level. In general, the negotiation track has started to revive again. Nevertheless, no specific agreements on the volumes of supplies, timelines, or parameters of a possible ceasefire have been publicly announced. And this is exactly what adds weight to this meeting. Trump has moved into private talks with Ukraine since the NATO summit earlier this month, completely ignoring Russia. Let's put it this way. So, on July 8, Donald Trump met with Volodymyr Zelensky at the NATO summit and had a one-on-one conversation with him. There weren't many details. Then Volodymyr Zelensky had a conversation with Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner. There aren't many details. The meeting between Zelensky and Trump is today. Again, there aren't many details. And during all this time, there hasn't been a single contact with the Kremlin, except for the meeting between Mark Rubio and Sergei Lavrov on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Manila. And even then, they only met briefly there for about half an hour. It's telling that some analysts, including Russian ones, are assessing the meeting cautiously, noting that it was largely tied to Graham's funeral and that there didn't seem to be any special preparation for it at all. This doesn't diminish its significance, but it does set the framework. For now, it's about restoring a channel of communication. About the attitudes in Donald Trump's team towards Ukraine, I talked about it. I discussed this in the previous episode on this YouTube channel, so be sure to check it out if you haven't already. But to make sure you don't miss new episodes on this YouTube channel, I recommend you subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There you can find announcements for all episodes, and we also post breaking news there as soon as it comes in. Now, about the second event of the day, which is taking clearer shape. In the US Senate, a bipartisan group of lawmakers announced that they had reached an agreement on a bill regarding sanctions against Russia and Iran. The bill is associated with Lindsey Graham, who promoted it together with Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal. And in the public sphere, this bill is called the Graham-Blumenthal bill. What's in this bill? The document gives the US president new powers to apply economic pressure on Russia. It provides for the possibility of imposing tariffs of up to 100% on Russian goods imported into the United States of America, but that's complete nonsense. As well as additional tariffs on the 5 largest buyers of Russian crude oil and natural gas and the 5 largest countries, helping Russia bypass energy restrictions. Separately, the document expands the sanctions regime against Iran. This was a condition Donald Trump himself insisted on, demanding that measures against Iran and Hezbollah be included in the bill. Trump supported the bill because now, with one move, he can hit both Russia and Iran with sanctions. In other words, the Senate is actually handing him all the tools to exert pressure. And as you know from the previous episode on this YouTube channel, the US has decided to return to using sanctions against Iran instead of bombing it. However, there are significant caveats that still separate the announced agreement from the actual implementation of this bill. First of all, the document has not been adopted yet. The vote in the Senate may take place this week, but the law will not come into force before September. Why? Because the House of Representatives will have a summer recess in August. The congressmen are going on vacation. Although, let me remind you, Donald Trump is demanding that Congress not go on vacation until they pass his package of election laws, which are already scheduled for November. So it's possible there won't be a break and this bill might get pushed through a little earlier. But still, I wouldn't get my hopes up. We should expect it in September. Secondly, until the last moment, some Democrats were blocking this bill. The issue is the mechanism. Because originally the document, developed by Graham and Blumenthal, provided that the decision to impose or lift sanctions would be made by Congress. Whereas the current version expands the powers of the president himself, and some Democrats fear that Trump will handle tariffs simply at his own discretion. Thirdly, here's an important detail. I would say the most important detail. China, one of the largest buyers of Russian oil, is now not subject to similar restrictions. According to Bloomberg, the Donald Trump administration sought not to escalate trade relations with Beijing, so China was quietly removed from the bill. This significantly narrows the potential effect of the sanctions, since China remains the key buyer. But to understand the significance of these two events, the meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump and the agreement on the sanctions bill against Russia, we need the context of the past few weeks, not just days, but specifically weeks. By the end of July, the diplomatic process around Ukraine was objectively at a dead end. On July 23 in Manila, there was the first meeting in almost a year of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The meeting lasted 35 minutes and ended without any results. Marco Rubio, following that meeting, stated that, quote, "There is a need, new ideas and new concepts, and that the previous proposals for Ukraine are unacceptable." And this was the most important thing that really infuriated the Russians. And after that, as you know, Lavrov started to speak, and this is a man's word. A man gives his word. A man keeps it. And he, was saying that Russia supposedly in Anchorage gave its word of honor that it would keep its promise, but the Americans didn't keep their word. Well, in general, this Russian riffraff crawled onto the international stage and opened its filthy mouth. But that's not really that important, because Marco Rubio, as a result of this meeting, stated for the first time that supposedly the United States of America will proceed based on what is acceptable to Ukraine. He says, look, all previous attempts didn't work precisely because they were unacceptable to Ukraine. Now we will develop new approaches to negotiations and pressure on Russia based on what is acceptable to Ukraine. This is a great shift and a great change of position. But at the same time, Moscow's position has hardened. According to Bloomberg on July 22, Vladimir Putin has abandoned the previous scheme of exchanging territory and insists on full control over Donbass. As a preliminary condition for any negotiations. Against this backdrop, Zelensky's meeting with Trump and the advancement of the sanctions bill looked like an attempt by Washington and Kyiv to restart this negotiation process, but from a slightly different angle, to approach it from another angle, through a combination of military support, economic pressure on Russia, and the restoration of the negotiation channel. Now let's talk about who benefits from all this and how and what the consequences might be for the main parties. This is based on the fact that the model of relations has changed. For Ukraine, the key practical interest is the license to produce Patriot interceptor missiles. The main problem with Ukraine's air defense is not the lack of the systems themselves. They have them. It's the chronic shortage of missiles for the Patriot systems, which is made worse by the fact that the US war with Iran has depleted America's own stockpiles of these interceptors. The localization of production, which was discussed at the meeting between Trump and Zelensky, and which earlier, by the way, Poland had also proposed to join. Kyiv is trying to cut its reliance on direct supplies. However, it's important to remain clear-headed and assess the situation realistically. Even with political agreement launching such production, according to Bloomberg's assessment, it requires a long time and still doesn't solve the problem in the coming months. For the United States of America, such a configuration is a way for Donald Trump's administration to simultaneously maintain the image of a peacemaker and increase pressure on Moscow through others, not directly. That is, not through direct military escalation, but through sanctions and selling technology to the Ukrainians. However, for Trump, there is also a domestic political cost here. Expansion of presidential powers. Tariffs are a sensitive topic after the US Supreme Court previously limited his trade tariffs, and that's exactly why the sanctions bill became a point of contention between the parties. For Russia, the immediate military effect of both of today's events is limited and delayed. Here the key word is delayed. Why? Because the sanctions, even if they are adopted, will not take effect before September. China has been exempted from these sanctions. And the supply of Patriot systems in the form of a production license is still a prospect, not an immediate boost on the front line. Nevertheless, the trend itself is unfavorable for Moscow. The restoration of contact between Kyiv and Washington at the highest level and bipartisan support for sanctions narrow the space for a stalling strategy, which, judging by Peskov's statement, the Kremlin is ready, quote, to wait until the Americans are free, and this is what the Kremlin is counting on. For Europe, the significance of the meeting is indirect. It fits into the general logic in which the US maintains its involvement in the Ukrainian issue, which eases some of the concerns of European capitals about the possible withdrawal of Washington from the process. At the same time, European pressure measures are also ramping up. This is the 21st package of EU sanctions. The mechanism for confiscating the Shadow Fleet's cargo. All of this works in the same direction as the American bill being discussed. But that's not all. Right now, the European Union is creating two very important mechanisms. First, they want to abandon the idea of imposing sanctions in packages. Because each package requires a vote from the entire European Union, there is always someone who is against it. They have to review all of this and so on. That's why the decision is made to vote on individual sanctions. They see where they can strike. We all vote yes and strike immediately. No need to wait for either the 22nd or the 23rd package. Plus, right now in the European Union, I'll tell you a little secret. They've already prepared a list of 1,600 companies and legal entities in Russia that they want to hit with sanctions. At the same time, they're trying to specifically target and collapse the financial and banking sector in Russia. But that's not all. We need to wait for official public statements. Then we'll definitely come back to this issue. What possible scenarios could unfold after the meeting between Trump and Zelensky today? The first and most likely scenario in the short term is the continuation of work at the delegation level, the announced meeting of Ukrainian and American officials, the possible trip of Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner first to Kyiv and then to Moscow. This was also discussed today. This is a way of slowly restoring the negotiation channel without any guarantee of results. The second scenario is the adoption of the Sanctions bill in September, which would give Donald Trump leverage over buyers of Russian oil, although with a caveat about exempting China from the sanctions. The third option, which cannot be ruled out, is that the process will stall again. If the positions of Moscow and Kyiv on territories and status remain incompatible, as was shown by the meeting in Manila between Lavrov and Rubio. So far, neither side has publicly shifted on fundamental issues, and the announced intensification of negotiations may remain at the level of format rather than substance. Bottom line, on July 28, two related events took place. One was the meeting between Zelensky and Trump at the White House, as a result of which the parties agreed to intensify the negotiation process and discuss the production of Patriot interceptors in Ukraine, and the announcement of a bipartisan agreement in the Senate on Lindsey Graham's Sanctions bill. Both events mean that the diplomatic and sanctions tracks have finally moved forward, but so far only at the level of intentions, at the framework level, and not specific agreements or decisions that have already come into force. How much of a breakthrough is this? I think the coming weeks will show. What should we pay attention to? Well, probably the vote on sanctions, the content of the announced meetings between the Ukrainian and American delegations, the visit of Witkoff and Kushner to Kyiv, and whether this formula will lead to an intensification of negotiations and ultimately real convergence of positions in the talks. This is what it's now very, very important to keep an eye on after today's meeting between Trump and Zelensky. I'll leave it at that. Your opinion, your conclusions, write in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel. Click the bell and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourself. Goodbye, everyone.